So class, this is when we're going to combine a lot of the techniques that we've learned in the last few days. The off mandrel building that we were doing this morning, and then some of the faux gather stripes that we were making around discs yesterday. So this is going to be built on a stainless steel chopstick instead of the glass punty, which was getting all wobbly when you were working just now. And I'm going to just draw out the different steps of this first. So you're going to have your chopstick, and your gather of glass that you're going to put on is going to go right in here. First, it's going to start out as round, and then we're going to flatten it like this. And now I'm going to start doing this from a front view. So here's the center, and this is going to be a flower shape. It's going to start just like the button that we made yesterday and the pendant we made this morning. But you can dot it or do whatever you want in the middle. I'm going to put little dots on it and encase this. And then I'm going to use that faux gather technique we were using to put a layer of glass around it. And then, do you remember we were making those gear shapes yesterday? And you make oversized dots around the edge. And this is going to be an opaque layer here, and these dots are going to be the same color opaque. And you're going to fill in between these dots with transparent glass. Now this is tricky because the transparent glass is stiffer than the opaque glass. So when these layers go on, the opaque is going to be really soft. But in order to keep that difference between those, that sort of shape it's going to turn into when you flatten it all, you're going to have to keep these parts really cool, because that transparent glass is going to want to be stiff and in those spots too, and you want to keep those separate from one another. And then the final layer will be more dots. So this is going to look like this. And you're going to come in and put more dots on that are going to be the petals on the flower. We're going to punty off onto the center, which is going to be encased, so you can just use that color for your punty. And then we'll put a loop on the top of it and take it off the stainless steel chopstick. Okay. Go fire up the torch. So this is the first time you guys have worked on the stainless steel chopstick. This is a great thing to build on. First of all, it's lightweight and it's round, so you can roll it in your hand. I used to build all my pendants on the glass rod, and Dustin Tabor showed these to me one day, and I said, "That's it. Those are great." And I still make starfish pendants and some of them on the glass rods, but for a complicated off mandrel pendant like this, I've switched to using these stainless steel chopsticks. So we start with the transparent for our matrix, like we have been all along. It's stiffer glass, so it's much easier to do these sculptural techniques with. So when I make off mandrel things, every once in a while something will fall on the top of the table and I'll have to scoop it up. So it's nice to have this platform here. I always have to remind myself at this stage to make this small. I tend to go really large and then not be able to keep everything hot. I'm going to heat up the chopstick a little bit. The chopstick, you can burn a hole in this, so you just want to get it warm, just enough for the glass to stick to it. So here's my gather, and I'm going to put it on the chopstick. And the part of the chopstick that should be sticking into the glass is just that top domed part of the chopstick. And let it fall away a little bit. And flatten it into this Maria shape. And I'm going to use an opaque for the dot. This is just like the buttons we made yesterday and that round pendant we made this morning, you guys. Except for now you've got this nice stable chopstick instead of your wobbly glass rod. And I want to center this gather right on top of that one and wind off. And then I'm going to use my marver to push this in. And again, we're going to use that like cake frosting motion to push the opaque right into the transparent below.
Is that a special tool?
Yeah, I really like using stainless steel, especially for this cake frosting distributing that I'm doing. This marver is one that I had made to special dimensions that I like. It has a nice like knife edge too, so I can control some of the edges. You know, for instance, this isn't perfectly round, but if I was being really picky, I could come in here and push things around a little bit. So now I've got a nice opaque part to decorate. I'm going to put a whole bunch of teeny dots on here, just randomly placed, not equidistant from one another, sort of like an animal print. Some little, some big. The one great thing about making flowers and other organic things is that they don't have to be perfect, just like they are in nature. Okay, melting those dots in. Now, anytime you encase something, you want to melt the dots all the way in so you don't trap air bubbles in there. Woo! So I'm making another gather to encase those dots and magnify them. Now I want you guys to see a side view of this. It's important to keep this a little thick. We're actually going to wrap, after I do the encasing, we're actually going to wrap glass around this, and if it's too thin, you'll have no place to put the glass. So it's important that this is pretty thick. Okay, so nice big gather on top. And while it's still hot, you want to press it down. And again, using that cake frosting motion, distribute the glass. Now I want to leave a frame of the opaque below. So I'm just gently going around the whole thing and pushing it in. Inspecting the sides just to make sure I've got the same size frame on all the sides of it. So now you see the dots magnified. Okay, the next layer is the one that's going to go below those dots. I'm going to use an opaque color for that. So you really want to make sure that you have that wide place to attach this. You want to make sure that when you're applying this, you don't touch that frame or the transparent glass from the encasing. You really want to keep this on the side of the structure. So the base bead that I start with, I always call the matrix, whether it's on a mandrel or off. So the matrix in this case is that teal glass I started with. Okay, so you want like a small grape size gather. And now when I use a full gather to swipe around a disc or an off mandrel pendant like this, I let it actually get a little stiff and take it out of the flame first so I can control it a little bit better and let it fall away from the glass rod. And heat the end just a little so that when I first apply it, I have some control, but it also sticks. And then I get a sort of profile view of it so I can make sure that's good thickness. And then I say a little cheer because it went on pretty evenly. Now if it doesn't, you can certainly come in, heat up a little bit more and stripe it on. Now you really want to make sure these layers are well melted together. You can do that on the back. It's the best thing about working on a chopstick is you don't have to worry about getting heat back here. If this was a glass rod, this would be bending all over the place when you put heat back here. But working on a chopstick, you don't have to be afraid to get the back of this hot. So I'm just heating the seam on the back of this, melting the layers together. And often I'll introduce a tool, not because I'm actually moving any glass, but just because I'm introducing something cold to the structure, and that firms it up, makes it a little easier to work with. Okay, now I think it's easiest to apply glass to a flat surface. So I'm going to flatten the top of this ridge. And I'm going to put on dots, same color as that ridge. And that's what's going to give me that nice effect, that gear shape effect. You have to use the same color as that ridge for your dots. And remember, these dots are those big, oversized ones. And wind off. I served frozen yogurt for summer, so I got really good at that little swirl motion. And now your dots, you can either do this the traditional way of spacing them out by doing like north, south, east, west, and filling in between them. You can just wing it, which is what I do sometimes, and I'll just go around and put my dots on and say a little prayer that they line up well. The important thing is that you want about a dot's distance between these large dots. So at this point, I'll sort of map it out in my head. I'll say, okay, if I put one there and I put one there, that's going to be pretty big gaps between them. So instead, I'm going to go for 3 dots between these, which means I could just do, this is, if I was doing north, south, east, west, how I think of it. Here's the east and the west. And now when I'm dotting, whether it's big or small dots, I think about placement first and then size of the dots second. So right now I'm placing the dots, not thinking too much about how big or small they are compared to the others. And notice in between my dotting, I always come back and warm things up. And notice as soon as I come out of the flame, I'll use gravity to sort of help my dot tilt one way or the other. Okay. So now I see this one's huge, and I take some off. A lot of my rods look like this when I put them down on the rod rest. Okay, so I'm going to come in with the transparent now, and I choose something that has a lot of contrast that just helps the effect that I'm trying to create. So this is ink blue, one of my favorite 104 colors. And it's important now to keep the opaque cool and the transparent that I'm adding hot. Hot, 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 hot. Orange, glowy, flowing. And I'm going to put about a dot's worth of glass in between each dot. Now this is a really forgiving technique. If your dots aren't nicely shaped or sized, it doesn't really matter. You'll still get a great effect from this. So, yeah, I was just going to say, I like skipping around. It keeps the heat even throughout. I don't get one part of this too hot. That sky blue is a really soft color. And if it gets too hot and my dots start to combine, it will definitely hurt the overall effect in the end. Okay, so it looks lumpy, but wait till you see what happens here. Okay, so I now put the heat, I turn my torch up a little bit, and I'm putting the heat in between the dots. So instead of on the dots now, I'm heating between the transparents and opaques. I'm melting them into that first opaque layer I made and into one another. Use my tweezer masher, and when things start to get just a little bit out of control and feel a little too soupy, I'll come in with my tweezer masher and really slowly start to thin this out. Here's a little side view so you see how thin I'm making this. Don't worry about this not being circular. You'll be able to fix all of that. Right now you're just trying to bring the transparent and opaque dots into line and get this sort of gear effect. Now you can start to see that sort of sunshine or gear shape. And it's always best when you're using tweezer mashers to not just like really smush it all flat at once. It's much better to do this slowly, steadily. Okay, now I'm going to make this a little bit more circular. And the next layer is going to be the petals. I'm thinking I'll make a more exciting color choice. Use this coral. I love coral and sky blue together. It's one of my favorite color combinations. Lots of contrast between them. They're both really happy colors. They both behave nicely in the flame. It's always exciting when you order coral glass. You never know exactly what color it's going to arrive. Well, sometimes coral comes in, it's very orange. Sometimes it comes, it's very pink. So of course I want to save a little bit of every batch I order. So now I've got 20 colors of coral in my stash. Okay, so there's that nice gear shape. Now you don't have to use that effect in a bead like this. You could certainly apply it to any sort of disc that you're making on a mandrel. So I'm going to put these dots on top of the transparents. And it's nice to have something to aim for. So I'm just going to go on top of each of those little transparent windows and apply a dot of coral. See how much more relaxed you can be when you're building on a stainless steel chopstick than on a glass rod. So just like before, I'm trying to apply the dots randomly around it, not sort of just go dot, dot, dot around the whole thing in order. And that keeps the heat consistent throughout the whole piece. Okay. Now, when I layer dots, I make a little platform on top, I make it into a little stump so that when you look at it from the side and it's flattened, like these are going to be petals, so I'm going to squish them. I like when there's a stripe through the petal that's nice and straight and even. So before adding my next layer of glass, my transparent on the edge, I'm going to flatten these. And here's some Rubino, and the Rubino likes to be in a more oxygenated flame. Okay, so this is going to go on top of each of these little stumps. Now when I'm applying the dot, this is just what we were talking about yesterday when we were stacking dots. You are pushing down so that the footprint of your dot is the size of the stump. And then when you bring this into the flame and you disconnect, you're going to heat the seam between the two dots, and that will turn it into one dot instead of a dot that sort of looks like, I don't know, stacked tires or something where there's like sort of a separation. It all looks like one giant dot on the side. Okay, let's get some heat through this. Sometimes I forget and I ignore the back, and it's important to really soak this with heat. Okay, did I get them all? I think I did. Okay, so now I'm just going to try to make them consistent in size. And a little pair of the bent mashers. Here they are. These are foil and leaf tweezers for picking up foil and placing it on your bead. I use them as little mini mashers. They're great for petals on flowers, whether the flower is big or small. Okay, so I'm heating all sides of that oversized dot. Smush it flat. Again, I'm skipping around, keeping the heat even throughout. heating all sides of it, smushing it flat. You want to make sure not to catch that ridge, the gear ridge with your mashers, and just get the petal. Okay, a little more heat on the back, remembering to keep this whole thing warm. One more. Okay. So, because it's not done till I ruin it, I'm going to put some tiny little dots and some little crevices here. Let's see, I'll use this yellow. So I'm going to put some dots down these little opaque roads here that are between. The yellow and the blue is a really nice contrast. Again, remembering every few dots I make to bring it back in and warm it all up again. And what I always try to do is identify a place where I'm likely to have it crack apart and make sure that I especially heat right there. And that always seems to happen between layers that aren't well fused together. So it's going to happen between the opaque glass and that transparent matrix I have. If this is going to crack, that's where it's going to crack. So that's where I apply my heat. Okay, so one more set of dots here. And I like that these are going to get gradually smaller as they go out towards the edge. So this line of dots around is going to be just a little bit smaller than the inside set. And I'm going to make one more set, push my luck, and put them between the petals. And this is certainly the trickiest part. It's like the game of Operation. Woohoo! Okay. So now I get to puntee off on the front here. And now the trick with the cold seal is really to have the two things that you're attaching be different temperatures. So first I'm going to shape the puntee, and I like it to be like a dull crayon, like we were talking about yesterday. That's the ideal shape for a puntee, like that. And I also want to make sure it doesn't have a crack in it. And if it does, I'll just pull off the glass and start again. Okay, so I'm going to let this cool off so my bead can remain sort of warm. This is the last time I'm really going to be able to get a lot of heat through this and make sure the heat is even throughout. Okay. And I'm going to heat this off the mandrel now. So the heat on the back is intense. The chopstick is getting glowing red, and so is the glass. And when I feel them start to move, I pull off the chopstick. So there's the back of it. And while I have something on a puntee, I'm always thinking in my head, what's the next thing I'm going to do? So there's just not that much time between the steps. So I'm going to make my loop next and heat up. You always want to make your loops transparent glass. A loop is a tricky little thing to make, and it's a sculptural form, which is much easier to do with the transparent because it's stiffer. Let's get that off here, just in case this falls on the tabletop. So for a loop on something that's this size, I make it about the size of a blueberry. The gather, I make it about the size of a blueberry. And I find a good, strong petal. And I'm gonna attach it pretty wide footprint here, pretty wide attachment, turn everything upside down. I pull the glass towards me and then turn everything right side up and loop it down on the back. And then as soon as I disconnect, I heat everything back up because that was a lot of time to let this all get cold. Remember, this is going to be laying against your body, so you want that to be comfortable and flat on the back. Find my tungsten pick. And this is good for sort of rocking the loop forward a little bit. Okay, now, I think the easiest way to get this to the kiln is to use your tungsten pick as your little carrier. So now I'm just burning off that little nubby on the front of it. So there's my pendant and into the kiln. Okay. So making that was a little bit like making a disc bead because you're working on the chopstick as if this was your mandrel. So you're winding up the glass this way, which is what we did the first day, right, you guys? So you guys should be a little used to how that feels, especially now that you have something stiff to work on. It will feel very much like making a disc on a mandrel. And my starfish pendant, which is the other thing I'm gonna make, it also has a similar sort of axis where you're making it on the center of the back, just like that flower. So I'm gonna make one of these guys. It's gonna have a much smaller matrix that you're working on. And I think it's very hard to get a chopstick out of this without losing that nice like articulated angle in there. So I'm gonna build this on a glass rod. Yep, I'm gonna use, how about this guy? And clean it off a little. Now when I make a starfish pendant, I'll keep a third of the rod in my left hand, and the other 2/3 are going to be the glass that I build the matrix from. I always start with a full rod of glass for this. So this is going to now be what my chopstick was in the last pendant. So here's that same Maria shape we started with before, but much smaller. A little bit more glass. So for making a starfish, I pick out a transparent color for the base. When I'm working with 104, because the transparents are so much stiffer, I always use a transparent for my matrix. And then the next layer is going to be opaque, and then the next one is transparent, and then you get to put opaque dots on top. So when I'm working with 104 glass, it always goes transparent, opaque, transparent, opaque. So I just pick out 2 transparents and 2 opaques to start with. And you know, my favorite part of like color in glass is layering the transparents on top of the opaques. So I'm going to make a like blueberry size gather for each of the arms of the starfish, and I'm going to place them around the sides. So here's my blueberry size gather, and I'm going to make a really wide footprint here. And I hesitate and pull away really slowly and then burn off up here. Now, if it doesn't turn out perfectly pointy, let's say it turned out more like that, you can just bring your cold rod in and pull it to a point. So the trick, it's just like pulling off a dot or pulling off part of a dot. If you have a cold rod and a hot dot, you can pull some of the glass away. So I'm going to make 5 of these legs. And of course, in an ideal world, they all be the same size and length. So that means that we would try to make consistent size gathers. So again, I'm going to try to make this that blueberry size. And I'll put it right next to the other one. And it's all in like the angle you're pulling away at. So if I'm going to make 5 legs on this, I want to make it a little less than a 90-degree angle from the other leg. Of course, I use a little bit of gravity there to pull it down. So with this pendant, you have to be much more careful about heat on the back of it. Not only will, if you have a hot, cold on the back of this, you're likely to get a crack in the rod that you're working on. That's sort of a nightmare at this point in a pendant. So I do my best to try to keep the heat on the front of this. I know this is like the last thing people like to hear, but it's just over time getting to know the glass well enough that you know it's not so hot that it's going to melt and not so cold it's going to crack. No, that's not ever what anybody wants to hear. Practice, practice, practice. It really is. I mean, the only way you get to know the heat in the glass is by heating the glass a lot of times. I had a soccer coach who always said 1,000 touches every day. You touch the soccer ball 1,000 times a day, and your feet will just get to know the ball. And the same thing goes for the glass. There's nothing that can take the place of practice. Just lots of hours on the torch. Even if you're making stringer, I mean, actually, especially if you're making stringer, you're watching the glass stretch. You also get to know the colors. You get to know that like coral turns gray when it's heated up, and you know that by how gray it is, how hot it is. Okay, this is getting really short. Here, let's do this. Thank you, Vanna. So this is a little Italian rod holder. When I found this many years ago, I was very pleased because this often happens to me. And here's my last starfish arm. So, to finish my answer to that question, I can tell how hot the glass is by what color it is. And I know especially like these dark transparents, you can tell how hot they are right away. As soon as they get a little bit of heat, they start to turn orange. We saw also there's opaques that take a long time to turn back to an opaque once they're hot, especially like this grasshopper green. Some of the opaques for a long time, while they're warm, they look transparent, and it makes it hard to see that dot when you've encased it or something. Okay, so next layer of this starfish. I'm going to take the seams out that are between the legs and the matrix. So heat, heat, heat at the base of all those legs. And I'll use my tweezer masher. And smush each one flat. Now, nothing is going to smush that's not hot. So if I want this all to get thinner, which is my goal here, it's not to make it thin isn't my goal, it's to make it a consistent thickness throughout. Right now, each of the legs has a really thin tip and a thick base. And what I want to do is distribute the glass down the whole leg. So by heating the front and the back, and smushing it, it moves some of the glass from the base to the tip. I think a lot, like my heart pendants and my starfish, I think a lot of my beads somehow look like iced cookies. So this is like the part of the cookie that you bake, and then the icing are the other layers. Icing is the other layers. Okay, so heating that seam all the way out to the edge of the arm and swishing it flat. Again, I skipped around. Just like in the flower, you want to keep the heat consistent throughout, so I won't just go in order around the starfish. Okay, so let's make this a little bit tighter. And how I would do that is I'd warm up each side of each leg, make sure it's flat, and then just articulate that little place where they come together using my knife. The marver has that nice edge on it too. I like the heat there. Put the heat there and then use that nice flat edge and the little knife part there. So these marvers that I have made, you guys all have one at your station now to use too. And if you love it, you can quit. It's great too. The steel is fabulous because it does grip the surface of the bead a little bit. I find that with the graphite, it's kind of slippery and you can't really push the glass around as easily. So I'm really fixing all these little angles and flattening the sides here. I do a lot of things here by looking at the profile. So notice I have to bring, it's just like when you're working on a bead, like a disc bead or on a mandrel. Checking the profile is a good way to see like the height of dots. And in this case, the length of the arms. There we go. There's the angle I'm looking for. Okay. Now I want to make sure these are all sort of in the same plane, that it's perfectly perpendicular from the rod I'm working on to the plane that this is all in here. So checking that 90-degree angle on all the arms. This spot in here is not quite as thin as I'd like it to be. I'm going to do a little operation. There we go. And I'm going to pull off a little glass from the tips of all these to get them to be a little bit pointier. They start to just round out when you spent a long time fixing. The glass always wants to make itself round and have the smallest possible surface area. It would be very, very, very hard to build this out of opaque glass. I know, I have tried, and until I really figured out how stiff the transparents are compared to the opaques, I was frustrated. And so now I really pretty much only make transparent starfish, especially with the 104 glass. When I'm using bullseye, which I use a lot, you can use opaque as a base color because all the bullseye colors are very stiff. Okay, so the most susceptible place to cracks are the ends of all of these arms. So right in there. So that's why I keep bringing this back into the flame and hitting the tips of those. Of course, it's also the most susceptible place to melt and get round, and you want to keep them pointy. So you got to keep that balance there. Okay, so I'm going to pick an opaque color to go on for the next layer. Periwinkle, again, a color that is really stable, consistent. Always a good choice if you're trying something for the first time. You just know how it's going to behave. It's going to come out looking exactly like this too. The color stays the same. So one thing that's really important, we've been talking about a lot in class, is every time you're going to add something else, is to make what the matrix or whatever you've got so far all a consistent temperature. You wouldn't want to add hot glass to an arm when it's hot. Otherwise you'd be pushing it. So you want to make sure the entire matrix here is the same temperature. Then there'll be no surprises when you touch this glass to the arm. Okay, so this is a little tricky. You're going to take these pea-sized gathers and you're going to stripe them down the legs, starting at the top. And until I had to teach how to do this, I didn't really understand what I was doing, but now I figured this out. I can explain it a little bit better. You're going to make a drip sort of shape, and the smallest part of the drip gets placed at the tip of the arm, and then you kind of herd the glass towards the center of the pendant. Don't worry about how much glass you're leaving behind at the center. If you had a huge blob there at the center, it wouldn't matter at all. You'll see, we'll pull all that off. So again, here's my drip, and then herding the glass. And I'm pushing down pretty hard against the base, that transparent color, and I'm pushing down a little harder the closer I get to the center, and that's what's making that stripe get thicker and thicker as I get towards the center. Okay, here it is again. Here's the drip, and I push it against there, and then I herd the glass towards the center. And then as soon as I'm done, I come back in and I heat those layers together. I don't want to take the seam out completely. I like a little bit that frosting on top of the cookie isn't melted all the way in, but I do want the layers to stay together in the long run. You want them to be well fused. So here it is again, drip, push against the base, and herd the glass towards the center. And then come back and heat up that seam again. Okay, now don't forget about those tips. Warm those up. Last one. See how I've got this big glob in the middle? This happens every time. Okay, pushing harder as I get towards the center to sort of widen the path of the glass. Okay, so this is a really common thing that happens to me too. I have a place where I didn't quite push hard enough, and you can just use a knife or your marver and tuck the glass in there, in that spot. So Sage Holland, who was a big mentor of mine in my early years, and continues to be, she said the best bead makers are the ones that know how to fix their mistakes. And I see how true that is every time I make a bead. I'm always solving problems when I'm making beads. And when I take classes or I watch other people demo, they might not tell you they're fixing a mistake while they're working, but often if you watch closely enough, they're sort of making up for something that didn't quite go wrong. They're pushing a dot over a little bit. And the whole time you're assessing the situation, seeing what you can do about it. And of course, one of the other important things to remember too, especially when you're making a bead where it's multiple steps like this, is you want to make sure that before you go on to the next step, that everything is perfect from the last one. You know, you don't want to go on to the next layer of this until all the parts are fixed. It's like when you're building a bead on the mandrel, the same thing is true. You want to make sure your barrel that you're dotting is the perfect shape before you start putting the dots on. It's really hard to go back and fix the shape of a matrix after you've got dots on. Okay, so now we can fix the shape of this little guy here. I'm gonna, again, articulate all these little angles on this opaque layer. And I just sort of rock the knife up through that little corner there. So another reason to make sure that you really heat the layers together is you don't want this to get too thick. That's surely a disaster if these layers start to pop apart. So before I go on to the next layer, the transparent layer, I'm going to heat these all pretty well. And because, as I said before when I was making the last pendant, you really want to make sure that you're also going to be adding the next layer to a flat space. So I'll come in and sort of flatten all of these too. So it's not like lumpy. Okay. Pull these up just a little bit, keep them all in line, keep that perpendicular angle between the rod and the arms. I'm always making small adjustments like that. Okay, so on top of this periwinkle, what's new? I reached for the ink blue. Love this color. And in green and purple, you can't go wrong. Every shade of green goes with every shade of purple. So this next layer is much like the last in that I'm going to do those drips and push them towards the center. But this time you want to keep the frame of the opaque. So you have to be a little bit more fussy about placement. Here's my drip, pushing it towards the middle. Heating out that seam. Well, not heating it out, but heating the seam. Again, here's a drip. Hurting the glass towards the center. Heat on the seam. Okay, now coming in to warm up all the tips. When these tips crack off, it's usually while I'm putting the transparent layer on. You know, it doesn't start to crack apart until you're almost done. And again, I'm skipping around, not doing the ones necessarily right next door. Heat on the seam. Okay, now I'm getting everything toasty. Pull off all that glass in the middle. Okay, articulate those angles. and then use the flame just enough. I want to soften them just a little bit. There we go. Okay, now my favorite part, I love putting on the dots. And that's because usually in the case of my beads, the dots are never having to be in a perfect place. Again, I make a lot of natural organic shapes, and so it's okay that some of the dots are bigger than the others. The coral has a lot of contrast with the ink blue, so it's a good choice for the dots. I always make sure I put one dot right in the center because that's where I'll punty. And every few dots, I remember to come in and warm up the tips of the legs. Great. And generally, I make bigger dots towards the center and smaller dots as I get towards the tips of the arms. So when you all are making this, I'm going to be coming around telling you all to keep those tips of the starfish warm. It's the most common issue with these. Anytime you're making off mandrel things, it's always the things that are sticking out the farthest that are susceptible to cracks. Okay, so I'm going to just take out all the undercuts on the dots. Roll this into a nice punty. Find a dot to punty up to. And burn off my rod. Also remembering to heat up all the tips of the legs. Just like when I made the flower pendant first, you want to make sure at this stage that you're getting everything a consistent temperature at this point, because while you're making the loop, that's when everything can cool off. You're really having to direct the heat just at the loop part, so it's important to really get everything up to temperature first before you start the loop making process. Okay, so I need this in this hand. So now I'm heating the seams out of the back. I like that a lot of people ask me how I make this pendant, and it's good to take the evidence away. And when you take out the seams, you take the evidence away. So if you do get a crack in the tip of an arm, I don't have one, but I do often. A good way to heat that out is at this point right here. I'll superheat the end of the leg and I'll pull it out with a knife or a tweezer, and as long as you pull the glass through the crack, you can get that crack out often. It's hard to be patient enough to wait till this stage sometimes though if it's in there. Try to fix it before now and it sort of messes up the front. Okay, so whoa, here goes my loop. So again, pretty big pendant, so I want a pretty big gather to make my loop. Now, a lot of people also ask while I'm making this if I'm worried about the front of this cracking. If you've made this thin enough, you don't have to worry about it. Enough heat can travel through it where you don't have that issue. If you've made it very thick, which I have seen these made very thick, you start losing the transparent layer and the dots start to crack off the front while you've got all this heat on the back. There's my warning. Okay, so now I sort of see which way this looks best. I think this arm up is a good way to do it. Okay, so I attach the glass kind of to the back of it so I don't disturb the design on the front. I pull towards my hand, up and around, stick it on the back. So again, now these tips of these arms have been out of the heat for a long time. I always get jealous of people who work in boro who can let the glass stay out of the flame for so long and not have to worry about cracking. But I think it's worth it that we get all these wonderful colors in our soft glass. Okay, so I'm going to fix this loop a little. Let it set up right on top. And again, the back is flat enough, and I'm just going to crack it off the punty and put it in the kiln. Yay.